Today's presentation is on the autonomic nervous system. The outline of the presentation is as follows. We will talk about the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system, beginning with general functions, anatomy, physiology, and lastly, we will contrast the somatic versus autonomic system. There are two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. There's the sympathetic, otherwise known as the thoracolumbar division, and the parasympathetic or craniosacral division. The sympathetic nervous system is responsible for the flight or flight response, and it tends to be energy demanding. The anatomy is that it originates from all thoracic and the first two lumbar spinal nerves, so T1 to L2. Its general functions include stimulating the heart rate, stimulating intestinal sphincter constriction, it relaxes the urinary bladder, it dilates the pupils, it increases sweat secretion, and it makes your hair stand up or hair erection. It inhibits stomach and intestinal movements and relaxes bronchial muscles. And if you think about it, it makes sense. It's flight or flight, so you're basically stimulating the heart rate so that you can run faster, fight harder, and you want to inhibit GI motility because you're prioritizing potentially life-saving maneuvers such as running away or fighting. The parasympathetic division is responsible for your rest and digest or repose and repair. It tends to conserve energy, and the anatomy is from the brainstem nuclei and S2 to S4. That's why it's known as the craniosacral division. Its general functions are generally opposite that of the sympathetic division. And here's an even further comparison. So let's go through these, okay? So let's start with the eyes. So the parasympathetics, they constrict the pupils. Sympathetic nerves dilate the pupils. And if you think about it, it makes sense. In a flight response, you want to dilate those pupils so that you can allow more light to enter the eyes so that you can see better. And they also, in sympathetic, you inhibit salivation, whereas parasympathetic nerves stimulate salivation. Your sympathetic nerves increase your heartbeat. You know, that makes sense because you want your heart to beat harder. You want to increase cardiac output so that you can work better, work faster. Parasympathetics slow the heartbeat. Sympathetic nerves also relax the airways so that you can breathe in more air. Parasympathetic constrict airways. Sympathetic nerves inhibit GI motility. So it inhibits stomach activity, it inhibits the gallbladder, it inhibits the intestines. The parasympathetics do the opposite. The sympathetics also act on the adrenal glands to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. And sympathetic nerves relax the bladder, whereas parasympathetic nerves contract the bladder. You ever wonder why people wet themselves when they get scared? This is why. Let's talk about the anatomy of the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system has sympathetic ganglia, and these ganglia lie lateral to the ventral surface of the spinal cord. So these are the ganglia right here, and they look like a chain of beads. And there are preganglionic neurons, so neurons that are between the spinal cord and the ganglion. And these preganglionic neurons synapse with postganglionic neurons. And these preganglionic neurons or presynaptic neurons are also what are known as your white rami communicantes. Okay. And there are different routes of exit of sympathetic axons. These are your postganglionic nerves. So you have your sympathetic ganglion. These are your postsynaptic nerves. So they can exit through spinal nerves and innervate various organs such as sweat glands, smooth muscle, in blood and blood vessels of the skin, etc., etc. It can exit through sympathetic nerves, which innervate various visceral organs, as shown here. They can exit through splanchnic nerves as well, and they form visceral ganglia, such as celiac, superior mesenteric, and inferior mesenteric. And these ganglia correspond with the major visceral arteries, such as the celiac artery, superior mesenteric artery, and inferior mesenteric artery. And they also innervate various abdominal pelvic structures as seen in the picture. It also innervates the adrenal glands, specifically the adrenal medulla, which secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. Let's talk about the parasympathetic nervous system and the anatomy of the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, the parasympathetic ganglia, they lie either within or near their effector organs, okay? And as I already mentioned, the parasympathetic nervous system is known as a craniosacral nervous system because it has nerves that originate from these cranial nerves and from the sacrum. So the cranial nerves are the oculomotor, which is cranial nerve 3, facial nerve, cranial nerve 7, glossopharyngeal, which is cranial nerve 9. So oculomotor innervates the smooth muscle in the eyes. The facial and glossopharyngeal innervate the salivary glands. And in the vagus is pretty important. So most of the parasympathetic fibers are in the vagus nerve, and these nerves go to the heart, lungs, esophagus, stomach, pancreas, liver, small intestine, and colon. So basically most of the thoracic and abdominal viscera. And it has nerves from S2 to S4, which go to the bladder, colon, rectum, and the reproductive organs. And let's talk a little more about the differences in anatomy between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. So, as I've already mentioned, they come from different regions of the CNS. So sympathetic, thoracolumbar, parasympathetic, craniosacral. So thoracolumbar, that's T1 to L2, craniosacral, that includes some of the cranial nerves as well as S1 and S2. The location of the ganglia are different. So the sympathetic ganglia are close to the spinal cord and in a chain. The parasympathetic are close to their target organs or their effector organs. The length of the postganglionic fibers are different. Sympathetic have long postganglionic fibers, as well as short preganglionic fibers. Parasympathetic have short postganglionic fibers. And this makes sense because if their ganglia are close or in the effector organs, then the postganglionic fibers don't really have a long way to travel. And then postganglionic branching, sympathetic got lots, parasympathetic got little. Let's talk a little bit about neurotransmitters. So the two main neurotransmitters are acetylcholine and norepinephrine. So acetylcholine are secreted by cholinergic axons, called cholinergic because it's from acetylcholine. And acetylcholine includes all autonomic preganglionic axons. Both sympathetic and parasympathetic preganglionic axons are cholinergic. They secrete acetylcholine. And all post-sympathetic postganglionic axons are also cholinergic. Therefore, the parasympathetic system is known as the cholinergic system. Norepinephrine are secreted by adrenergic axons, and basically almost all sympathetic postganglionic axons secrete norepinephrine. Therefore, sympathetic system is known as the adrenergic system. So this is important. So basically, for the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic fibers secrete acetylcholine, the postganglionic fibers secrete norepinephrine. For the parasympathetic nervous system, both the preganglionic fibers and the postganglionic fibers secrete acetylcholine. And then, of course, there are different receptors. I'm not going to go into too much detail. Other than that, there are two types of cholinergic receptors, two types of receptors that respond to acetylcholine, nicotinic and muscarinic, and there are two types of adrenergic receptors, alpha and beta adrenergic receptors. These are receptors that you're going to learn more about in your physiology course. Now that we've talked about the autonomic nervous system, let's compare the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So the somatic nervous system, that's your conscious nervous system. So its effector is skeletal muscle. For the autonomic nervous system, its effectors are various glands in the body, as well as smooth and cardiac muscle in different organs of the body. The general function, so generally the somatic nervous system works at a conscious level. It can also work unconsciously as well. The autonomic nervous system is largely unconscious. That's why it's called autonomic, because it's unconscious. The effector response, so the somatic motor nervous system is responsible for skeletal muscle contraction. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for stimulating or inhibiting an effector depending on which target organ you're dealing with. Neuron arrangement from CNS to effector. There's only one neuron. In the autonomic, there's two. You have the preganglionic neurons and postganglionic neurons. The cell bodies in the somatic nervous system, they're located either in the motor nuclei of the cranial nerves or the ventral horn of the spinal cord. In the autonomic nervous system, preganglionic are in the autonomic nuclei of cranial nerves or lateral horn of spinal cord, and the postganglionic cell bodies are in the autonomic ganglia. Number of synapses in the somatic nervous system, 1, but autonomic it's 2. The first is between the pre and postganglionic neurons, and the second is between the postganglionic neuron and its effector organ. Axon myelination. Somatic motor neurons are myelinated. In the autonomic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons are myelinated, but the postganglionic neurons are not. Neurotransmitter in the somatic nervous system is acetylcholine through muscarinic receptors. In the autonomic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons secrete acetylcholine. Postganglionic neurons secrete either acetylcholine or norepinephrine. If it's the parasympathetic nervous system, postganglionic neurons are secreting acetylcholine. If it's the sympathetic nervous system, the postganglionic neurons are secreting norepinephrine. Type of receptor. In a somatic nervous system, you have nicotinic receptors. In the autonomic nervous system, the autonomic ganglia have nicotinic receptors. And muscarinic for acetylcholine in the autonomic, and alpha or beta for norepinephrine. Now this slide right here is just another visual representation of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Feel free to look at this at your leisure. This slide says we are done. So go in peace and review this material. Peace.